Most people think of intimacy as something born from affection, desire, or the quiet pull between two human hearts. But in ancient Sparta, it was nothing of the sort. There, the act that creates life was stripped of emotion and reshaped into an instrument of the state. It wasn't romance, it wasn't pleasure. It was a duty, a biological assignment issued by a government obsessed with crafting the most formidable soldiers the ancient world would ever face. Spartans weren't nurtured as individuals. They were assembled like military equipment. Their story didn't begin on the training grounds or in the clang of iron shields. It began in bedrooms turned breeding chambers, in a society that viewed the human body not as something personal, but as a resource belonging to the state. The popular image of Sparta, gleaming bronze, crimson cloaks fluttering in the wind, warriors delivering bold last words, hides something far darker. Behind the legend lies a cold and calculated machine of human engineering, a system so severe it makes fictional dystopias feel tame. At the heart of this system was one belief: Sparta must control the creation of Spartans. Love held no authority in choosing a partner. Attraction had no seat in marriage. The only matchmaker was the state itself. Elderly magistrates, men whose lives had been spent marching in formation and burying comrades, evaluated young citizens with the detachment of farmers inspecting livestock. Height, bone structure, stamina, ancestry, these were the qualifications that mattered. A man from a line of decorated warriors was paired with a woman whose body promised strong offspring, broad hips, resilient muscles, and proven health. Beauty wasn't about charm. It was a biological signal, a marker of good breeding. Marriages were contracts for the production of strength. The heart was irrelevant. Desire optional. The body was a tool, and the state held the handle. Women, too, were shaped by this philosophy. They were not viewed primarily as wives or caretakers, but as the vessels through which Sparta's future army would emerge. Their value was measured not in tenderness or domestic skill, but in the strength they could gift the nation through childbirth. Spartan girls trained from childhood, not to wield spears, but to withstand the ordeal of bringing warriors into the world. They raced across dusty fields, grappled in sand pits, and hurled javelins under the scorching sun. Their bodies had to be hardy, because their sons had to be unbreakable. It didn't matter what dreams they held. It didn't matter whom they loved. The state had already decided their purpose. Yet the system grew even more unsettling the deeper it went. Consider what happened when a warrior's wife could not conceive, or when she bore children the state deemed fragile, or when another woman in the city possessed exceptional health but was married to a man past his prime. To Sparta, this wasn't a family matter. It was a resource problem. Their solution was chilling. A celebrated warrior could be permitted, sometimes encouraged, to impregnate another man's wife. The husband often agreed because producing a physically superior child was considered a service to the homeland. Fidelity meant nothing compared to the duty of strengthening Sparta's bloodline. A woman's womb could be lent like a tool of the state. Her body offered to ensure the next generation would be strong enough to defend the city. Affection, loyalty, personal boundaries. These concepts were sacrificed on the altar of perfection. The goal was not happiness. It was purity of form, the relentless pursuit of a flawless warrior caste. And the brutality did not end with conception. When a Spartan infant finally entered the world, celebration was not guaranteed. The first cradle a baby knew wasn't its mother's arms, but the judgment of the state. The child was brought to a council of aged warriors, a grim assembly known as the Gerousia, men who had survived more winters of battle than most lived to see. They evaluated the newborn without emotion, checking its limbs, its cries, its perceived potential. Any sign of weakness could end its life before it truly began. This wasn't considered cruelty. It was policy, a cold calculation that a single weak body could endanger an entire nation surrounded by enemies and an enslaved population far larger than its citizen army. In Sparta's eyes, mercy today could mean ruin tomorrow. If the baby was approved, it returned to its family not as a cherished child, but as a future soldier whose life already belonged to the state. If it failed the evaluation, its fate turned far darker. The infant was carried to a remote slope on Mount Taygetus, to a stark cavity in the earth known as the deposits, a place where the unwanted were abandoned to the elements. Wind, cold, and predatory beasts completed what the council had started. To the Spartans, this was not murder. It was nature removing what it had crafted imperfectly. This was only the beginning of a Spartan's life, a life forged in hardness, shaped by the needs of a city constantly preparing for war. Surviving infancy didn't mean salvation. It simply meant the real shaping could begin. From the moment a Spartan boy drew breath, his life was charted out like a military campaign. His parents were not raising a son. They were temporarily safeguarding state property until the government came to claim it. That moment arrived when he turned 7. At an age when most children cling to their parents, a Spartan boy was taken from his mother's side without ceremony. Tears were discouraged. Hesitation was shameful. Even mothers, conditioned by generations of ideology, surrendered their sons without outward grief. A final embrace, a whisper of pride. Then the child stepped into a world where softness had no refuge. This was the beginning of the Agoge, a training system unmatched in its ruthlessness. The boys lived in packs known as Agoge, brotherhoods forged through hunger, cold, and competition. Their instructors were not gentle teachers, but hardened veterans who viewed childhood as an obstacle to be crushed, not nurtured. These men did not shape minds with books or stories. They shaped them with deprivation. The boys slept on beds they constructed themselves, tearing up reeds with their bare hands from the banks of the Helots River. They wore a single thin tunic through blistering summers and freezing winters. Their cloaks were coarse, their shelters cold, their food scarce by design. Hunger was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. To survive, they were expected to steal food, firewood, scraps, anything that could keep them strong. Theft wasn't shameful. It was admired. It trained stealth and cunning, qualities essential on the battlefield. But getting caught was a grave offense, not because stealing was wrong, but because failure exposed incompetence. In Spartan logic, a warrior who couldn't slip unseen through the shadows had no use to the state. Pain became a teacher. Hunger became a companion. Silence became a shield. Their instructors enforced brevity with brutal discipline. Questions had to be sharp. Answers had to be sharper. Idle speech earned punishment. Wit was valued. Hesitation mocked. A careless word could bring humiliation, sometimes worse. Over time, the boys learned to speak only when words served a purpose. The world still remembers this as being laconic, the Spartan manner of speech that cut through conversation like a blade. But the greatest cruelty often came not from their teachers, but from each other. The older boys held power over the younger, ruling their groups with the authority of petty tyrants. They ordered, punished, berated, and challenged the children beneath them. This hierarchy was intentional. It forged leaders and followers alike. Younger boys learned obedience. Older boys learned control. Every day was a battlefield of social dominance. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Friendships were rare because affection was dangerous. Trust bred vulnerability. They became masters of reading intention, of judging tone, of detecting weakness. They learned to strike before being struck, to mock before being mocked. Emotional armor grew thick. Emotional warmth grew thin. In this environment, the only path to respect was through toughness, boldness, and the refusal to break. The Agoge's lessons escalated as the boys approached adolescence. Endurance became the highest virtue. Suffering became a test of character. This philosophy reached its darkest expression in a ritual held at the shrine of Artemis Orthia, a ceremony known less for its religious significance and more for the brutality it sanctioned. Offerings of cheese were placed upon the altar. The boys were ordered to retrieve them. It sounded simple, almost childish, but to approach the altar, they had to sprint through a corridor of whips. Leather strips cracked through the air, slicing into their backs and legs with every step. This was not a test of agility. It was an examination of willpower. The boy who could endure the lashes without crying out proved himself worthy. Some smiled through the agony. Some collapsed. A few died. These deaths were not mourned, not publicly. To the Spartans, such boys had earned honor through their silence. But the harshness of the Agoge was not limited to ritualized pain. The boys were crafted into both hunters and prey. They learned to disappear into forests, to track silently across rocky terrain, to conceal their presence even in their own city. They learned to sleep with one eye open and eat with both hands ready to strike. Every movement was training, every mistake a potential beating. Their bodies hardened, their minds sharpened into something dangerously focused. Yet even all this was still the preparation phase. The true final test awaited a chosen few, those who demonstrated exceptional intelligence, cunning, and emotional emptiness. These were selected for a shadowy trial known as the Krypteia. To most Spartans, the Krypteia was spoken of only in guarded whispers. It was neither a unit nor an army. It was a purge machine. Each year, a handful of the best graduates were chosen and sent into the countryside with only a dagger and minimal rations. They were ordered to remain hidden during daylight, stalking the fields under the cover of night. Their mission was chilling. Eliminate any Helot who appeared strong, bold, or rebellious. The Helots were the enslaved population who farmed Spartan land and vastly outnumbered the citizens. Fear was the only leash keeping them from revolt, and the Krypteia was designed to tighten that leash. These young men were not killing enemies in battle. They were murdering unarmed laborers in darkness. It was the final psychological severing from normal human morality. A boy who could kill without anger, hesitation, or guilt proved he belonged fully to the state. He had crossed a threshold from which he could never return. To make this slaughter legal, the Spartan government performed its own sinister rituals. Each year, the ephors declared a symbolic war against the Helots. This bureaucratic act permitted the killing to proceed without it being considered murder. It was a political trick crafted to soothe the conscience of a society that had little conscience left. By the time these young men returned from the Krypteia, they had completed their transformation. They had entered as boys shaped by harsh discipline and emerged as tools honed for violence, emotionally cauterized, mentally sharpened, and spiritually hollow. At 30 years old, after decades of communal living and ceaseless training, a Spartan man was finally allowed to leave the barracks and return to domestic life. But freedom wasn't quite the right word. His new duty was simply another extension of the state's will. He was expected to father the next generation of warriors. And marriage in Sparta was unlike anything in the rest of Greece. Marriage in Sparta did not unfold with songs, feasts, or joyful parades. It began with a ritual that looked more like an abduction than a union. The bride-to-be was seized, symbolically, but with a seriousness that mirrored the state's beliefs about emotional distance. Her hair was cut short, her body clothed in a man's cloak, and she was left waiting alone in a darkened room. This transformation was meant to strip away softness, disguise her youth, and emphasize the purpose the state assigned her. Not companionship, but reproduction. The groom visited her secretly, slipping away from his barracks in the night. Their meeting was brief, quiet, and hurried. He returned before dawn, long before anyone noticed his absence. This strange tradition wasn't random or romantic. It was engineered to prevent affection from growing too strong. A Spartan man's primary loyalty, the state insisted, must remain with his fellow warriors and his commanders. Domestic bonds were allowed only if they did not interfere with military duty. And yet, Spartan women were not the silenced, sheltered figures so common in other Greek cities. They were among the most educated, outspoken, and physically capable women in the ancient world. While the men trained for war, the women managed estates, oversaw property, and kept the economy functioning. Their strength was not a threat to the system, it was an essential pillar of it. Every law, every tradition, every expectation worked toward the same objective: to produce children who could withstand the furnace of Spartan life and emerge as warriors. Spartan mothers were expected to be as unyielding as the sons they raised. If a child faltered, there was disgrace. If a child triumphed, the honor belonged not to the family, but to Sparta itself. Stories spread across Greece about the ferocity of Spartan mothers. One legendary tale told of a woman who, upon hearing that her son had fled a battle, killed him with her own hands, believing he had betrayed the very purpose of his existence. Whether true or exaggerated, such stories reflected the values the state infused into its citizens. Loyalty to Sparta outweighed loyalty to blood. While boys endured the Agoge, girls underwent their own regimen. They ran, wrestled, chanted battle hymns, and performed athletic contests. Strength, not modesty, defined feminine virtue in Sparta. A strong woman meant healthy children. A healthy child meant a stronger army. Their bodies were temples not of beauty or seduction, but of national survival. This ideology echoed far beyond the city's borders. Even the philosopher Plato, observing from Athens, admired what he thought was a society striving toward equality. But he misunderstood it. Sparta wasn't pursuing fairness. It was pursuing efficiency, a biologically optimized civilization in which value was measured by utility, not individuality. Inside this system, emotions were trimmed away like overgrown branches. Tenderness was treated as a flaw, affection as vulnerability. Children grew up without sentimental attachment to their parents, because family bonds could weaken the unity of the phalanx. A Spartan warrior was expected to hold the shield line beside any comrade with the same trust he might give a brother. Personal loyalties were a distraction, dangerous even. As boys became men, they returned from the barracks emotionally hardened, physically sculpted, and psychologically conditioned to prioritize the state above all else. Yet now they faced a new paradox. To keep Sparta alive, they needed to create life. They had been trained to fight, not to nurture, but marriage and fatherhood were obligations, not choices. Children were not raised with affection, but with expectation. Every son was a soldier in the making. Every daughter was a future vessel of endurance. Two people joined by decree, performing rituals they did not choose, fulfilling roles they could not refuse. This was the human engine at the heart of Spartan power. For a time, the system worked. In fact, it worked so efficiently that it helped transform a small, rocky city-state into one of the most feared military powers in the ancient world. The Spartans were few in number, but their discipline made them formidable. Their armies marched with unity unmatched by any other Greek force. Their soldiers were not simply well-trained, they were sculpted from birth for war, sharpened by hardship, and honed by brutality. But perfection, as Sparta defined it, carried a hidden cost. Every system that demands purity eventually undermines itself. The first cracks appeared slowly, almost invisibly, like stress fractures in iron. The Spartan obsession with selective breeding created a dangerously narrow population. Every infant abandoned on the mountainside, every weakling cast out or denied a place in the warrior caste, every life culled in the name of strength, it all reduced the gene pool. Sparta's rigid citizenship requirements meant that only a small number of families were considered true Spartans, and that number shrank with each generation. As the battlefield claimed more and more soldiers, Sparta found itself unable to replace them. Other Greek cities could recruit farmers, artisans, or foreigners to fill their ranks. Sparta had no such flexibility. Each warrior was the result of a decades-long process beginning in the womb. Losing a single soldier meant losing the product of generations of planning and breeding. This demographic time bomb ticked quietly beneath the surface of Spartan society, and it was only one part of the approaching collapse. The second flaw was Sparta's complete refusal to adapt. The Agoge forged warriors of immense discipline but limited imagination. They excelled at obeying orders, holding formations, and enduring hardship. But they were not trained to innovate or question. As warfare evolved, with new tactics, new formations, new weapons, Sparta's military doctrine remained frozen in time. Their greatest strength slowly became their greatest liability, a rigid army facing a rapidly changing world. And the third poison seeped in through success itself. For centuries, Sparta had lived under strict laws that forbade luxury, wealth accumulation, and excessive comfort. But after defeating Athens in the Peloponnesian War, a flood of foreign wealth poured into the city. Persian gold clinked in Spartan coffers. Foreign envoys showered them with gifts. The iron discipline that had defined Sparta for centuries began to erode. Inequality spread. Land became concentrated in the hands of a few. Families that had once prided themselves on austerity now indulged in the luxuries they had long despised. Corruption crept quietly into the cracks. The social structure that had once seemed unbreakable began to sag under the weight of greed. Sparta's decline was not sudden. It was a slow unraveling, a fabric pulled apart thread by thread, even as its leaders tried to tighten their grip. The breaking point came on a plain far from home, beneath the banners of an enemy who fought with ideas unlike anything Sparta had ever faced. Sparta's unraveling reached its climax on the battlefield of Leuctra. There, an enemy general named Epaminondas shattered centuries of Spartan dominance by refusing to fight them on their terms. He stacked his forces deep on one wing and drove straight into the Spartan right, where their king and best warriors stood. The Spartan line, rigid and proud, buckled under an idea they had never prepared for. When their king fell, the myth of Spartan invincibility fell with him. With so many elite warriors dead, the already shrinking citizen population collapsed. The machine that had spent generations forging perfect soldiers discovered the truth too late. A society obsessed with purity cannot survive its own perfection. Sparta could no longer replace the men it had lost. Its rigid system had no room for change, no space for new blood, no flexibility to adapt. Over time, the once feared city became a curiosity, an echo of a world that had burned itself out. Travelers arrived to watch reenactments of old rituals, shadows of a culture that had sacrificed humanity for strength, and found only extinction waiting at the end. And that is the legacy of Sparta's grand experiment. A people who tried to craft flawless warriors only to break the very foundation of their own survival. Their story endures not just as a tale of power, but as a warning. A society that demands perfection may gain soldiers, but it loses everything that makes life worth defending.